Emily chose St. Benedict Farm in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, as one might choose a hiding place. There were no luxury hotels, no banquets or guests, just a colonial stone and wood house, silent among the century-old vineyards, from where the valley could be seen as if it too were suspended in time. The distant mountains seemed to embrace that piece of world, protecting it from the curious eyes and sharp tongues that had pursued them so relentlessly since they decided to be together. Nathan, for his part, believed that this isolation was an escape from Charleston's sensationalist press, from parents scandalized by the marriage, from the rigid social rules they had violated by choosing love above convenience. But for Emily it was more. It was the place where she could, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, breathe without fear of being touched, without fear that the hands caressing her would bring with them the shadows of a past she had been trying to forget for so long. The Williams property had known days of glory. Generations of the family had cultivated not only the grapes that produced the most celebrated wine in the region, but also a deep Catholic tradition that manifested itself in the 18th century chapel erected in the heart of the farm. It was there, among hand-carved wooden saints and frescoes faded by time, that their story had begun under the shadow of the sacred. Emily had been hired as an art restorer to recover the paintings that adorned the walls of the Williams family chapel, which had fallen into abandonment since the tragic death of the firstborn Jason 3 years earlier. The work was delicate, meticulous, almost surgical. Each brushstroke needed to be carefully removed to reveal the original colors underneath, like peeling away an old wound, hoping to find new skin. Nathan, an architect graduated from the University of Virginia and reluctant heir to a winemaking dynasty in financial decline, spent whole days watching her work. She was quiet, meticulous, immersed in details as if touching open wounds with the tips of her fingers. There was something hypnotic in the way she handled the brushes, as if each movement were a whispered prayer, as if she were conversing with the saints painted on the walls in a language only they knew. He felt drawn to her, not just for her beauty, though Emily was beautiful in her discreet way, with her brown hair always tied in a low bun, her intense green eyes that seemed to hold secrets of the entire world, but for something more rarefied and disturbing. The way she seemed to exist on another frequency, as if she knew secrets the world had already forgotten, as if she carried within her an ancient pain that made her both fragile and unbreakable. For weeks, the only words exchanged between them were about the work. Emily explained restoration techniques with the patience of a dedicated teacher, talked about the history of sacred art in colonial America, about the pigments used by 18th century artists. Nathan pretended interest in the technical details, but was actually fascinated by how her lips moved when she spoke, by the absolute concentration on her face when she worked, by the delicacy with which she treated each saint, as if it were a loved one who needed care. The desire between them was born slowly but surely, the kind of attraction that doesn't shout but whispers, and therefore cuts deeper, penetrates the bones and settles there like a low-grade fever that never completely passes. It was an almost tangible tension that stretched through the chapel, hair like the smell of ancient incense, an electric current that activated every time their hands touched by chance, every time he leaned over her shoulder to get a better look at the work and smelled the soft lavender perfume she wore. But Nathan was engaged to Jessica Foster, daughter of an agribusiness executive and granddaughter of an influential senator. It was a silent agreement between traditional families to financially save the Williams property, a marriage of convenience disguised as romance that would be celebrated with pomp and circumstance at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Charleston, with 600 guests and social media coverage. Jessica was everything expected of a wife from the Southern elite, elegant, well-educated, with a master's degree in business administration from Europe, skilled in the arts of social conversation, and absolutely aware of her role as the future matriarch of a traditional family. Emily, in turn, was the antithesis of that gilded reality. Raised by nuns at St. Clair's orphanage in Old Mill, after being left at the institution's gates as a baby, with only a note that said, "Take care of her as if she were your own daughter," she grew up between morning prayers, heavy domestic work, and a rigid education that mixed catechism and military discipline. She was shy by nature and by training, disciplined down to the smallest gesture, quiet by habit and by fear. But there was a contained fire in her, a passion for art and beauty that the nuns had never managed to completely suppress. Since childhood, she had drawn in the margins of prayer books, sculpted small saints from the soap they used to wash clothes, mixed the paints they made to paint the walls of the orphanage chapel. It was Sister Margaret, an elderly Frenchwoman who had arrived in America in the 60s with the mission of educating orphaned girls, who recognized Emily's talent and insisted that she study art. With a scholarship obtained through the influence of priest friends of the congregation, Emily studied restoration at the School of Fine Arts at the University of Virginia, where she became one of the best students in her class. But life outside the orphanage was a brutal shock. She didn't know how to relate to people her own age, didn't understand the jokes and pranks that colleagues made, constantly felt inadequate, as if she spoke a slightly different language than everyone else. When she graduated at 25, Emily had already built a solid reputation in sacred art restoration. Historic churches from across the state requested her services, and she worked with the silent dedication of someone who had found in art not just a profession, but a form of prayer. Each saint she restored was like an intimate conversation with Ruhm. The divine, each recovered fresco was a small victory against time and forgetfulness. It was through Father Thomas, parish priest of St. Rosary Church in Old Mill, that she received the invitation to work on the Williams Chapel. The job paid well, much better than she was used to, and the prospect of spending a few months isolated on the farm, away from the complications of city life, seemed almost a blessing. She didn't imagine that those months would completely change the course of her life. Nathan felt the heat of that contained fire before he even realized he was already in flames. At first, he tried to keep his distance, remember his obligations, the engagement, the responsibility to the family. But it was like trying not to breathe. Impossible for very long. He began to invent excuses to spend more time in the chapel, asked about details of the work he didn't need to know, offered help she didn't need to accept. And Emily, despite all her shyness and discipline, began to wait for these moments. Her heart raced when she heard Nathan's footsteps approaching through the nave of the chapel, and she had to make a conscious effort to keep her hands steady as she worked. There was something about his deep voice, the respectful way he addressed her, the genuine interest he showed in her work, that made her feel seen and valued in a completely new way. The first months passed in this careful dance, in this slow and respectful approach that resembled the courtship rituals of ancient times. They talked about art, about history, about the saints and their legends. Nathan told stories about his family, about his brother Jason, who had died so young, about the grandparents who had built the property with their own hands. Emily spoke little about herself, but gradually opened up, telling about life at the orphanage, about the nuns who raised her, about the discovery of her artistic vocation. It was on a December afternoon, when the Virginian heat seemed to melt, even the century-old stones of the chapel, that the first kiss happened. Emily was at the top of a ladder, working on a detail of the ceiling painting, when she lost her balance. Nathan caught her in the fall, and for a moment they stood there, glued to each other, breathing the same air, feeling the same racing heart, looking into each other's eyes as if seeing for the first time. The kiss was inevitable, gentle and desperate at the same time, filled with all the accumulated tension of those months of contained desire. When they separated, Emily was trembling, not from fear, but from an emotion so intense it seemed physical, as if all the nerve endings in her body had awakened at once. From that day on, everything changed. The relationship between them flourished, like the vines in spring, strong and fast, fueled by a passion that seemed to have a life of its own. They met in the chapel after all the farm employees had gone, talked for hours among the saints and candles, discovered in each other an affinity that went far beyond physical attraction. Nathan discovered in Emily a refined intelligence, an artistic sensitivity that touched him deeply, a purity that had nothing to do with naivety and everything to do with integrity. Emily discovered in Nathan a gentle and respectful man, someone who truly listened to her, who valued her opinions, who made her feel whole and desired, without pressuring or demanding more than she was ready to give. But the weight of reality soon imposed itself between them like a shadow. Nathan was engaged, had family obligations, a social position to maintain. The wedding with Jessica was scheduled for March. The invitations had already been sent, the contract signed. The union of the two families would save the farm from bankruptcy, would guarantee the future of the property that had belonged to the Williams for centuries. And Emily knew what her place was in that story. She was the hired restorer, the orphan who had no family or social position, the woman who should discreetly disappear when the work was finished, leaving everything as it was before her arrival. That's what always happened in her life. She fixed, cared for, restored, and then moved on alone. But love doesn't understand social conveniences or family obligations. Love doesn't ask permission to arrive, nor respect calendars or previously signed contracts. And what was growing between Nathan and Emily was bigger than both of them, stronger than conventions, more true than any commitment made without the heart. It was on a January night, when the summer rain drumming on the chapel roof created an intimate symphony around them, that Nathan made the decision that would change everything. He held Emily's hands between his, looked into her green eyes with all the seriousness in the world, and said the words she never imagined she would hear from anyone. "I love you, Emily. I love you in a way I didn't know was possible. And I can't pretend anymore that this feeling doesn't exist. I can't live a lie just to satisfy others' expectations. I want to be with you. I want to build a life by your side. I don't care about money, about social position, about what they'll say. I only care about you." Emily cried that night, cried with joy, with fear, with relief, with all the emotions she had kept in her chest for so long. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that she deserved to be loved, that she deserved to be happy, that she deserved to have someone who would choose her above everything and everyone. Defying all family ties, all social expectations, all previously established contracts and agreements, Nathan broke off the engagement in a tense and painful conversation with Jessica and the two families. There were no shouts or scandals, just a cold and cutting disappointment. A sense of betrayal that spread among members of the Southern elite like an oil stain on water. Nathan's parents were furious. Mrs. Williams, his mother, an elegant and traditionally Catholic lady, cried for days on end, repeating that he was destroying everything the family had worked for. His father, attorney William Williams, a respected lawyer in Charleston, threatened to disinherit his son, cut all relations, leave him with nothing. But Nathan was determined. At 32, for the first time in his life, he was making a choice based only on what he felt in his heart, not on what was expected of him or what would be most convenient for everyone else. The wedding took place in a small, intimate ceremony at St. Rosary Church in Old Mill, with the blessing of Father Thomas, who had known Emily since childhood and had followed her entire journey. There was no banquet, no gift list, no exotic honeymoon, just a promise made with the eyes that they would start from scratch, that nothing more would separate them, that they would build together a life based on true love. The few guests were simple people, some nuns from the orphanage where Emily had grown up, colleagues of hers, some old employees of the farm who had grown fond of the couple. On Nathan's side, only two distant cousins had the courage to attend, defying the family boycott. Emily wore a simple raw silk dress, without veil or train, which she herself had chosen in a modest store in Old Mill's historic center. Nathan wore a navy blue suit that had belonged to his grandfather, a way of maintaining some connection with family tradition even while being rejected by it. When they exchanged rings, both their hands were shaking, not from nervousness, but from pure emotion. It was as if they were finally where they should be, as if all the path traveled until then had been just a preparation for that moment of true union. But on the wedding night at St. Benedict Farm that Nathan had rented for the honeymoon, the promise was broken in a way that neither of them could have predicted. The house was perfect for a fresh start, spacious, airy, with windows that looked out over the vineyards and a porch where one could spend hours contemplating the mountains. They dined by candlelight, talked about plans for the future, about projects they wanted to develop together. Nathan spoke about transforming part of the family property into a cultural center, where Emily could have her own restoration studio. She talked about the possibility of teaching, passing on the knowledge she had acquired over the years. When they finally went up to the bedroom, the silence between them seemed sacred. Nathan was gentle, respectful, attentive to her every reaction. Emily was nervous. It was her first time, despite being 28, but also eager, full of love and desire for this man who had completely changed her life. The first moments were perfect. The gentle caresses, the slow kisses, the gradual discovery of each other's body. Emily gave herself completely, without fear, without reservations, feeling finally free to love and be loved. But when they consummated the union, when Nathan undressed Emily for the first time and saw her completely naked in the soft light of the bedside lamp, something strange happened. After the first gestures of love, after the intimate and sacred moment that should forever seal their union, he saw the blood. It wasn't the blood of virginity, which he expected and was prepared to receive with tenderness and patience. It was different, dark, thick, unexpected, in an amount that frightened them both. The white sheet was stained as if an old wound had opened, as if Emily's body held a physical pain she had never mentioned. The silence that followed was dense, loaded with a tension completely different from that which had united them. Nathan looked at Emily with concern, afraid of having hurt her, with an uneasiness he couldn't explain. Emily looked at him with the pain of someone who knew this moment would come, who had waited for and feared this revelation during all the time they had been together. And then, without crying, but with a voice that seemed to come from very far away, she told him. Years before, still a teenager at St. Clair's orphanage, Emily had been raped by Father Augustus, a visiting priest who had arrived from Washington, D.C., with impeccable credentials and the mission of evaluating the spiritual conditions of the institution. He had a soft voice and cold hands, a paternal smile that deceived even the most experienced nuns, and a way of talking about faith and purity that hypnotized the orphaned girls starving for paternal affection. Emily was 15 when it happened for the first time. She was a quiet, obedient girl who stood out in studies and manual work. Father Augustus called her for private conversations under the pretext of vocational guidance, said she had potential to follow religious life, that God had given her special talents that needed to be cultivated with care and dedication. The sessions started innocently. They talked about art, about saints, about the history of the church. Father Augustus brought books from Rome, showed reproductions of sacred art, talked about the great artists who dedicated their lives to glorifying God through beauty. Emily felt special, chosen, as if finally someone had recognized what she felt inside but couldn't name. But gradually the conversations took another turn. Father Augustus began to talk about the body as a sacred temple, about the importance of deeply knowing the divine creation to better represent it in art. He talked about the martyr saints, about how suffering purified the soul, about how some people were chosen by God to go through special trials that would bring them closer to sainthood. When the touches began, disguised as blessings and prayers, Emily was confused. Father Augustus explained that it was part of her spiritual education, that it was a way of understanding the sacred mysteries, that some special girls needed to go through this preparation to become true servants of God. She was very young, very isolated from the world, too desperate for affection and recognition to question the words of a man who represented the highest authority in her life. The nuns had taught her to obey without questioning, to accept divine designs even when she didn't understand them, to trust in the wisdom of hierarchical superiors. The violence happened on a Thursday afternoon in the orphanage library, while the other girls were in embroidery class. Father Augustus said it was time for Emily to fully understand the sacred mysteries, that God had chosen that moment to reveal to her truths that only pure souls could receive. Emily tried to resist when she understood what was happening, but he was strong, determined, and had all the right words to confuse her, to make her feel guilty for resisting the divine will, for questioning the authority of a holy man. When it was over, when she was bleeding and trembling on the library floor, Father Augustus knelt beside her and prayed as if nothing had happened, as if it was part of a sacred ritual, as if Emily's pain and blood were acceptable offerings to God. And then he explained, with the same soft voice as always, that this was a sacred secret between them and God, that if she told anyone she would be committing sacrilege, betraying divine trust, condemning her soul to eternal damnation, that other people wouldn't understand because they weren't chosen like she was, because they didn't have the necessary purity to receive those special revelations, Emily believed. She was a 15-year-old girl, raised to obey and trust religious authority, desperate to feel special and loved. She believed she had been chosen, that this was part of a divine plan she couldn't understand, but should accept with faith and submission. The abuse continued for months, always in the library, always on Thursday afternoons, always accompanied by the same prayers and theological explanations. Emily learned to disconnect from her own body during the encounters, to send her mind far away, to the frescoes on the chapel ceiling, to the art books Father Augustus had shown her, to anywhere but there. She began to have nightmares, unexplained pains, bleeding between menstruations. But when she tried to talk to Sister Margaret about the physical symptoms, without mentioning the cause, the older nun just said it was normal, that some girls went through difficulties during adolescence, that she should pray more and trust in God's will. The end came abruptly. Father Augustus was suddenly transferred to a parish in rural Kansas, without explanations, in the middle of an ordinary week. He said goodbye to Emily as if he were a loving father leaving a dear daughter, promised that he would pray for her every day, that he would never forget the pure and special soul that God had placed in his path. Emily was lost without the meetings. As terrible as what happened in the library was, it was also the only time she felt special, chosen, different from the other girls. Father Augustus's absence left a strange emptiness, an even deeper loneliness than what she felt before. It was only years later, when she began studying at the university and had access to information about sexual abuse, that Emily understood what had really happened to her. The revelation came like an earthquake, shaking all the structures of her faith, her identity, the way she understood her own past. The guilt was devastating. How could she have been so naive? How did she not realize she was being manipulated and abused? How could she have believed those absurd explanations about divine revelations and pure souls? Shame mixed with anger. Anger turned into depression. Depression manifested in recurring nightmares and panic attacks in intimate situations. She tried several times to seek psychological help, but the therapists seemed not to understand the complexity of religious trauma, the way faith had been used as a weapon against her, how the very words that should bring comfort had been transformed into instruments of psychological torture. The case had been covered up by the church. As an adult, Emily tried to investigate what had happened to Father Augustus after his transfer, but found only silence, altered records, a well-organized conspiracy to protect the institution's reputation. She discovered she wasn't the only one, that there were other girls in other orphanages, other parishes, other dioceses, but she also discovered that reporting would be useless. Father Augustus was well protected, had risen in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, had become a respected and influential figure. He had powerful patrons, experienced lawyers, a protection network that made any accusation easily discreditable. Emily learned to be silent, to accept, to pretend purity while carrying within her a wound that never completely healed. It only camouflaged itself under the obsessive discipline of work, under the almost fanatical dedication to the restoration of sacred art, as if each saint she saved from deterioration was a small revenge against the evil that had been committed in the name of God. The physical wound had healed poorly. The doctors she discreetly consulted over the years explained that the trauma had caused internal adhesions, small lesions that manifested in occasional bleeding, especially during situations of emotional stress or physical intimacy. That's why she had never seriously related to any man. Every time someone got too close, when the situation threatened to evolve into physical intimacy, the memories came back like an avalanche. Fear settled like a block of ice in her chest, and she fled. Nathan was different. With him, for the first time, she had felt safe enough to try. The love she felt for him seemed bigger than the fear, stronger than the bad memories. But the body has its own memory, its own defense mechanisms, and reacted to intimacy the only way it knew how, by bleeding. When she finished telling, Emily's voice was just a hoarse whisper. Nathan had listened to everything without breathing, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding her hands between his as if they were pieces of crystal that could break at any moment. The silence that followed was as dense as melted lead. Nathan looked at the woman he loved and felt a devastating mixture of tenderness, anger, pain, and helplessness. Tenderness for her courage in trusting him with that terrible truth. Anger against the monster who had destroyed the childhood and faith of an innocent girl. Pain at knowing she had carried that weight alone for so long. Helplessness for not being able to go back in time and protect her, for not being able to erase those memories, for not being able to make none of it have happened. And then he hugged her, a dense hug, full of mourning and tenderness, full of silent promises of protection and care, but also of a new pain, having been left out of that truth during all the time they had been together, understanding that the woman he loved was also a stranger, someone who carried within her a story he never imagined, traumas he didn't know how to heal. They did not make love that night, nor in the next ones. They just stayed embraced, talking softly, trying to rebuild intimacy on new foundations, with cards open on the table, with no secrets between them. Nathan was delicate, patient, respectful. He didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer, didn't pressure for details that might reopen still sensitive wounds. But he also couldn't completely hide the impact that revelation had on him. In the days that followed, while they were still at St. Benedict Farm, the intimacy between them oscillated between tenderness and estrangement. They talked for hours, walked hand in hand through the vineyards, dined by candlelight like a normal couple on their honeymoon. But there was a new tension in the air, a fragility that didn't exist before. Emily constantly wondered if he still desired her, or just felt sorry for her, if he looked at her as a woman or as a victim. If the love he felt for her was strong enough to bear the weight of that truth, or if it would gradually be corroded by the complexity of the trauma she carried. Nathan, for his part, plunged into a dense silence, moved by something he couldn't even name. It was as if Emily's revelation had opened a door in his mind to questions he had never allowed himself to ask. About the church, about faith, about the institutions he had been raised to blindly trust. He began to remember strange things from his own childhood, comments whispered among adults, conversations that were interrupted when children approached, an air of mystery and discomfort that sometimes hovered over family gatherings. And he began to remember his brother Jason. Jason was 3 years younger than Nathan, but had always been the more questioning of the two, the more rebellious, the one who asked uncomfortable questions and wasn't satisfied with evasive answers. He studied journalism at the University of Virginia, had plans to specialize in investigative journalism, dreamed of working for major media outlets, exposing corruption and injustices. In the months before he died, Jason had become strange, restless, obsessed with some journalistic project he kept in absolute secrecy. He spent hours researching on the internet, made mysterious phone calls, left the house without saying where he was going, and returned with a tense and worried expression. When Nathan asked what was happening, Jason just said he was working on an important story, something that could change many things, but it was still too early to talk about it. He needed more evidence, more witnesses, more confirmations before making anything public. The death had been officially classified as an accident. Jason was driving alone on a mountain road on a rainy dawn when the car went off the track and plunged down a cliff. The body was found 2 days later, along with the vehicle wreckage. Authorities concluded that he must have dozed at the wheel or lost control due to the road conditions. But there was always something that bothered Nathan about that explanation. Jason was a careful driver, knew that road like the back of his hand, and didn't have the habit of driving at dawn. What was he doing on that road at that time alone? Now, after Emily's revelation, Nathan began to wonder if his brother's death had really been accidental. If the story Jason was investigating had some relation to the church, to abuse cases, to the same network of silence and cover-up that had protected Father Augustus. It was with this growing uneasiness that Nathan began to search through his brother's belongings that were still stored in the attic of the family home. The parents had preserved everything as a kind of sanctuary, but never allowed anyone to touch Jason's papers and documents. Nathan went up to the attic one afternoon when his parents had gone out, carrying with him an anxiety that grew with each step of the stairs. Jason's room was exactly as he had left it. Journalism books spread over the desk, newspaper clippings pasted on the walls, an old computer that no longer worked. He began to systematically examine each paper, each note, each file. Most were college assignments, drafts of articles on ordinary topics, class notes. But at the bottom of a drawer, hidden behind a pile of magazines, Nathan found a folder marked only with a symbol he recognized: the coat of arms of the Archdiocese of Charleston. Inside the folder, there were dozens of documents printed from the internet, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes in an urgent and nervous calligraphy that he recognized as Jason's, and an unfinished letter, dated just 2 weeks before his brother's death. The letter was addressed to the editor of a major newspaper in New York and began like this: "I am writing to denounce a network of sexual abuse and cover-up that extends across several dioceses in the state of Virginia. I have in hand testimonies from at least 12 victims, documents that prove suspicious transfers of accused priests, and evidence that the ecclesiastical hierarchy not only knew of the cases, but actively worked to silence the victims." The rest of the letter was crossed out, rewritten several times, as if Jason was struggling to find the right words, to organize the information in a way that would sound convincing, and not just as unfounded accusations from an inexperienced young journalist. But one phrase, highlighted with yellow marker, jumped out: "What they hide under faith will kill someone, or has already killed." Nathan felt a chill down his spine reading those words. It was as if Jason had predicted his own death, as if he knew he was messing with dangerous forces, people willing to do anything to protect their secrets. He continued searching through the papers and found a list of names, all priests or bishops, with notes next to each one. Some names were circled in red, others had question marks, still others were crossed out with a thick line. And at the top of the list, highlighted with a hand-drawn rectangle, was the name that made Nathan's heart stop for a moment: Father Augustus. Bennett, Auxiliary Bishop of Washington, D.C., Cardinal Candidate. It was him. The man who had abused Emily was not only alive and well, but had been promoted in the church hierarchy. He was now a bishop, with considerable political influence, and was being considered for cardinal, one of the highest positions in the ecclesiastical structure. Nathan continued reading Jason's documents and discovered that Father Augustus had left a trail of victims wherever he went. Orphaned girls, young seminarians, vulnerable women in spiritual counseling situations. Always the same pattern: psychological manipulation using religious arguments, isolation of victims, veiled threats of eternal damnation if they spoke. And always the same institutional response: discreet transfers, altered records, silenced witnesses, discredited victims. A well-oiled cover-up machine that worked with the precision of a Swiss watch. Jason had discovered all this. He had collected evidence, talked to victims, documented cases. He was ready to publish an explosive story that would shake the structures of the Catholic Church in Virginia and possibly throughout the United States. And then he died in an accident too convenient to be a coincidence. Nathan sat on the attic floor, surrounded by Jason's papers, and understood that his honeymoon had definitely ended. There was no longer any way to pretend that he and Emily could simply isolate themselves from the world and live their love story in peace. They were connected to something much bigger and more dangerous than they imagined. Emily's trauma wasn't an isolated case, but part of a systematic pattern of abuse and cover-up, and Jason had died trying to expose this truth. When he came down from the attic, Nathan was transformed. The feverish uneasiness he had felt since Emily's revelation had crystallized into a cold and determined certainty. He knew what he needed to do. He found his parents in the living room having tea and watching the afternoon news as they had done every afternoon for decades, Mrs. Williams immediately noticed that something had changed in her older son. "Nathan, you're pale. Did something happen?" He sat in the armchair that had been Jason's, looked at his parents with a seriousness they hadn't seen in him since childhood, and said, "We need to talk about Jason, about how he really died, and about what he discovered before he died." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Attorney Williams slowly lowered the newspaper he was reading, and Nathan noticed there was fear in his father's eyes. Fear of what? Of what he might have discovered, or of what might happen if certain truths came to light. "Son," said Mrs. Williams with a trembling voice, "some things are better left buried. Jason got involved in dangerous matters, asked questions he shouldn't have asked. Don't make the same mistake." It was the first time they had admitted, even indirectly, that Jason's death had not been accidental. It was the first time they acknowledged that he had discovered something too important, too dangerous, too true to be ignored. Nathan looked at his parents and understood that they knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not the full extent of the conspiracy, but they knew that Jason had died because of what he discovered, and they had chosen silence, safety, the preservation of the family above justice. It was an understandable choice, a human one, but one that Nathan could no longer accept. Not after knowing what Emily had gone through, not after discovering that the man who traumatized her was not only free, but being rewarded with promotions and recognition. He stood up from the armchair, kissed his parents' foreheads with melancholic tenderness, and said, "Jason was my brother, Emily is my wife. I won't let the truth be buried with them." And he left the house knowing that he might not be welcome there for much longer. Nathan returned to St. Benedict Farm with a bag full of Jason's documents and a determination that burned in his chest like a live coal. Emily immediately noticed the change in him. There was something different in his eyes, a new intensity that frightened her and at the same time reassured her. It was as if he had finally found a purpose, a direction to channel all the anger and helplessness he had felt since the revelation on their wedding night. "I found something you need to see," he said, dumping the papers on the kitchen table, "of the colonial house, about the man who did that to you, and about my brother Jason." Emily approached slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal that might attack. Her eyes scanned the scattered documents, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, printouts from internet sites, blurry photographs, and then she saw the name that made her recoil as if she had been slapped in the face, Father Augustus Bennett. "He's not a priest anymore," Nathan said with a voice he was trying to keep controlled. "Now he's a bishop, auxiliary bishop of Washington, D.C., and according to what Jason discovered, he's being considered for cardinal." Emily's legs failed her. She sat heavily in one of the rustic kitchen chairs, looking at that name as if it were a venomous snake ready to strike. During all these years she had imagined that he might be dead, retired, forgotten in some obscure corner of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. She never imagined that he was not only alive and well, but thriving, rising higher and higher in the church's power structure. "How is this possible?" she murmured, more to herself than to Nathan. "How can someone who did what he did be promoted to cardinal?" Nathan sat beside her and began to organize the documents in a logical sequence, as if assembling a macabre puzzle. "Jason discovered that it wasn't just you. There are dozens of cases, Emily. Orphaned girls, young seminarians, women who sought spiritual counseling. Always the same pattern. He chose vulnerable, isolated people, desperate for affection or guidance. He showed her a typed list with female names, ages, and locations. Some had only initials. Others had full names, followed by notes such as died in 1998, suicide, or admitted to psychiatric clinic, religious outburst, or moved abroad, whereabouts unknown. Jason talked to at least 8 of them. Nathan continued, pointing to small stars drawn next to some names. He got testimonies, details, evidence. He was building a solid, irrefutable case. Emily picked up one of the printed testimonies and began to read. It was the story of a woman named Claire, who at 16 had sought Father Augustus for counseling after her parents' death in a car accident. The account was terribly similar to hers, The initial conversations about religious vocation, the touches disguised as blessings, the theological explanations about purification through suffering, and finally the abuse itself, always accompanied by prayers and threats of eternal damnation if she told anyone. She killed herself 3 months after giving the testimony to Jason, Nathan said softly. The family said it was depression, but a friend of hers told Jason that Claire had started receiving anonymous calls, threats, unsigned letters, saying she would go to hell if she continued spreading lies about a holy man. Emily felt a wave of nausea rise up her throat. It wasn't just the horror of knowing other women had gone through the same as her, but the understanding that there was an organized system to silence victims, to protect the predator, to ensure he could continue, rising in the hierarchy without anything tarnishing his reputation. And Jason discovered all this? She asked, leafing through the documents with trembling hands. Not only discovered, but was ready to publish. Look at this. Nathan showed her a draft of a journalistic article with the provisional title, The Network of Silence, How the Catholic Church Covers Up Cases of Sexual Abuse in Virginia. The text was almost complete, well-structured, with quotes from victims, analyses of official documents, statistics on suspicious transfers of priests. He had everything, Nathan continued, his voice loaded with admiration and sadness. Names, dates, locations, witnesses. He had even talked to a lawyer specialized in cases against the church, was preparing a civil action simultaneous with the publication of the article. Emily looked at her husband's face and saw there a mixture of pain and determination that made her immediately understand where that conversation was leading. You want to continue his work, don't you? Nathan nodded slowly. I can't let Jason have died in vain. And I can't let this monster be promoted to cardinal knowing what he did to you, to so many other women. Nathan, said Emily, holding his hands tightly, you heard what your parents said. If Jason was really killed because of this, if it wasn't an accident then we're at risk, I know. He looked into her green eyes with an intensity that made her feel as if he was seeing directly into her soul. But what kind of man would I be if I stayed silent knowing all this? What kind of husband would I be if I didn't fight for justice for the woman I love? Emily felt her heart tighten in her chest. There was something terrible, and at the same time exciting about finally confronting the demon of her past, about transforming years of silence and shame into something productive, into a fight for justice, not just for her, but for all the other victims. Where do we start? She asked, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. Nathan smiled for the first time since he had returned from his parents' house. It was a sad smile, but full of love and pride. We start by talking to the victims who are still alive. Jason left addresses, phone numbers, contact information. Some of them might be willing to talk again, now that they know they're not alone. They spent the rest of the afternoon organizing the documents, creating a chronology of the cases, identifying victims who could be contacted. It was emotionally devastating work. Each new account of abuse, each new evidence of cover-up, each new suspicious death or disappearance was like a punch in the stomach. But it was also cathartic. For the first time in years, Emily felt that her pain had a purpose, that her trauma could be transformed into something useful for other people. She was no longer just a silenced victim. She was a survivor with a mission. When the sun began to set behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in orange tones that reflected off the vineyards around the house, they had identified 6 still living victims who could be contacted. Nathan called the first one. She was a woman named Fernanda, now 42, married, living in River Junction. When Nathan identified himself as Jason's brother and explained that he wanted to continue the dead journalist's investigation, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I thought you had given up when I heard of his death, Fernanda finally said with a tired voice. I thought it was a sign that I should indeed stay quiet, as I always did. We haven't given up, Nathan replied, and you don't need to stay quiet. We have enough evidence now. We have other victims willing to talk. You're not alone. Fernanda agreed to meet with them the following weekend. But not in my town, she said. I don't want my husband and children to be involved in this. They don't know anything about my past. They arranged to meet in Charleston, at a discreet cafe in the city center. Nathan called the other 5 victims and managed to schedule meetings with 3 of them. 2 had changed their phone and address, apparently without leaving traces. That night, Emily and Nathan made love for the first time since the revelation of the trauma. It was different from the first time. Slower, more careful, full of a new tenderness that came not just from passion, but from complicity, from the sensation that they were united not only by love, but by a common cause. Afterward, lying embraced in bed in the colonial house, listening to the sound of crickets and a wind in the trees, Emily spoke softly in the dark. "I'm afraid, Nathan, afraid of what might happen to us if we mess with this. But I'm even more afraid of continuing to live knowing he's out there, doing the same thing to other girls." "We'll be careful," he promised, kissing the top of her head. "We'll do everything right, with lawyers, with serious journalists, with legal protection." But both knew that care might not be enough against adversaries who had shown themselves willing to kill to protect their secrets. The following Monday, they returned to Charleston and checked into a discreet hotel in the downtown district. Nathan had contacted an investigative journalist from the Charleston Post, an experienced man named Richard Sanders, who had a reputation for integrity and courage to face controversial cases. The meeting took place at a 24-hour diner on Main Street at 10 at night. Richard was a man in his 50s, grey hair, reading glasses hanging from his neck, with the tired appearance of someone who had spent decades unraveling the lies and corruption of Southern society. "I knew your brother," he said after Nathan introduced himself. "Jason was a brilliant kid, too brave for his own good. When I heard about his death, I suspected it wasn't an accident. He had approached me a few weeks before, talking about an explosive story he was preparing." "And why didn't you work together?" Emily asked. Richard gave a bitter smile. "Because my editor received a phone call. A very polite, very courteous phone call from someone very well positioned in the church hierarchy, explaining that it would be a shame if the newspaper published unfounded slander against holy men, that this could result in defamation lawsuits, loss of religious advertisers, problems with the Catholic community." "And you backed down?" Nathan wanted to know. "My editor backed down. I had no choice. But when Jason died, I knew I had lost the opportunity to do the right thing." Richard looked at the two with renewed interest. "If you have the evidence he collected, if you have victims willing to speak officially, I can try again. But this time, we'll do it differently." He explained that he had contacted colleagues in New York, journalists from larger outlets, less subject to local pressure. "We're going to prepare a coordinated story, publish simultaneously in several newspapers with backup copies on international websites. It will be impossible for them to suppress everything." In the following days, Nathan and Emily met with the victims who had agreed to talk. Each meeting was an emotionally devastating experience. Women who had carried the same traumas as Emily for decades, the same shame, the same fear, the same irrational sense of guilt. Fernanda, the first who agreed to talk, had a particularly shocking story. She had become pregnant after one of the abuses at 17 and was forced by the nuns to give the child up for adoption. "They said it was God's punishment," she recounted, crying, "that I had sinned and needed to pay for it by giving my child to a real Christian family." Anna, 38, had tried to kill herself 3 times after the abuses. She spent years admitted to psychiatric clinics, diagnosed with severe depression and personality disorder. "The doctors never asked about abuse," she said. "They just treated the symptoms, never the cause." Mary Hope, the oldest of the victims at 55, had become an alcoholic and lost custody of her children. She lived alone in a small apartment in Riverside, supported by a disability pension. "I knew no one would believe me," she said. "A drunk woman accusing a bishop, who would take that seriously?" Each story was a terrible confirmation of the pattern discovered by Jason. Father Augustus carefully chose his victims, always women in vulnerable situations, without solid support networks, desperate for spiritual guidance or simply for human affection. He isolated them, gained their trust, and then abused them, using their own faith as a weapon against them. And afterward, when the abuses ended, there was always the same institutional response: silence, denial, transfer of the aggressor, discrediting of the victims, a perfect cover-up machine that had worked for decades, allowing predators like Father Augustus not only to continue their crimes, but to be rewarded with promotions and prestige. Richard worked intensively with the material collected by Jason and the new testimonies obtained by Nathan and Emily. He verified each piece of information, confirmed each date, validated each document. The story was taking shape, a devastating text that would expose not only Father Augustus's crimes, but the entire cover-up network that had made them possible. But on Thursday of the second week of investigation, something changed. Nathan was leaving the hotel when he noticed he was being followed. It was a man in a dark suit, sunglasses, who always maintained the same distance from him, stopping when he stopped, changing direction when he changed. At first, Nathan thought it might be paranoia, an effect of stress and accumulated tension. But when he reached the parking lot where he had left the car, he found all 4 tires punctured and a note on the windshield. Some truths are too dangerous to be told. He immediately called Emily, who was at the hotel transcribing one of the recorded interviews. "Get out of there now," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Take our things and go to the reception. Stay with people around you until I get there." When Nathan arrived at the hotel by taxi, he found Emily pale and trembling in the reception, a small suitcase in hand. "Someone called the room," she said, a male voice very polite. "He said I was too beautiful a woman to die young, that I should convince my husband to stop messing with matters that weren't our business." They left the hotel and went directly to Richard's house in the Garden District. The journalist received them with the somber expression of someone who was already expecting that visit. "They know," he said as soon as they entered the living room. "I don't know how, but they know we're investigating. I received a phone call this morning, very similar to what your wife received. Someone very well informed about our investigation, who knew details that only the 3 of us knew." "Someone is watching us," Nathan said, "intercepting phones, following our steps." "Or someone very close is passing information," Richard suggested. "One of the victims you contacted might have gotten scared and told someone from the church, asking for guidance about what to do." Emily sat heavily on Richard's living room sofa. "So it's over? We'll have to give up like your editors gave up years ago?" Richard looked at her with an expression that mixed admiration and concern. "Not necessarily, but we'll have to be smarter, more careful, and maybe faster than we planned." He went to the office and came back with a folder full of documents. "The story is ready. 3,000 words, 6 detailed testimonies, documents that prove the suspicious transfers, analysis of the pattern of behavior. It's all here." "And now?" Nathan asked. "Now we publish before they can stop us. I have contacts in New York who can publish this still this week, simultaneously on the internet and in print. Once it's public, it becomes much harder for them to suppress it." Emily looked at the 2 men and felt a mixture of fear and exultation. After so many years of silence, finally her voice, the voice of all victims, would be heard. But she also knew that once they crossed that line, there would be no going back. "Are you sure we want to do this?" she asked Nathan. "Once the story is published, our lives will change forever. We'll be exposed, judged, maybe threatened. Will you still want to be married to me when everyone knows my story?" Nathan knelt in front of her, held her hands tightly, and looked into her eyes with all the intensity of the love he felt. "Emily, I married you for who you are, not despite who you are. Your story, your trauma, your courage, all this is part of the extraordinary woman I love. And if publishing this story means that other girls won't go through what you went through, then that's what we're going to do." Richard observed the scene with the contained emotion of someone who recognizes a historic moment when he sees it. "Then it's decided," he said. "I'll make some calls. The story comes out on Sunday." But none of them imagined that, while they were making that decision in Richard's living room, a black car was parked across the street, and that inside it, someone was carefully noting each movement they made, each word they managed to hear, through sophisticated listening equipment. The war had begun, and the enemy had more resources, more experience, and much less scruples than they imagined. The story was published on a Sunday morning that would forever change the lives of all involved. Richard had worked until 4 in the morning making the final revisions, checking each comma, each quotation mark, each statement that could generate defamation lawsuits. At 6 in the morning, the text was simultaneously on the Charleston Post website, the New York Times online, and 3 independent journalistic blogs with great national reach. The title was simple and devastating. The Network of Silence: How a Bishop Candidate for Cardinal Sexually Abused Dozens of Women for 3 decades. Emily and Nathan had been awake since 5, now staying at the house of a distant cousin of Nathan in North Bay, a supportive woman who offered shelter without asking questions. They followed the publication on their cell phones, obsessively, reloading the pages, watching the numbers of shares and comments grow exponentially every minute. At 7 in the morning, Richard's phone rang for the first time. It was the press officer of the Archdiocese of Charleston, with a tense and controlled voice, requesting an urgent meeting to clarify some serious misunderstandings published that morning. At 8, the phone rang again. This time it was a lawyer from Washington, D.C., representing diverse interests of the Catholic Church in the United States, informing that a defamation lawsuit would be filed that very Monday with a request for moral damages in the millions of dollars. At 9, it was the turn of a man who identified himself only as a friend of the Williams family to call directly to Nathan's cell phone, a number he had given only to very close people. The voice was polite, almost paternal, but carried a threat as clear as a knife held to the throat. "Nathan, my son, I knew your grandfather, your father. I followed the growth of your family. It would be a terrible tragedy if something happened to you and your wife because of a misunderstanding. There's still time to resolve this in a civilized way. Just a public retraction, an apology, and everything can go back to normal." "Who are you?" Nathan asked, but the line had already been cut. The impact of the story was immediate and overwhelming. By 10 in the morning, the subject was a trending topic on Twitter, with hashtags like "Justice for the Victims" and "Charter Church of Silence." Sexual abuse victim support groups began to mobilize, offering legal and psychological support for the women who had the courage to speak. But the institutional reaction was also quick and brutal. At 11, an official note from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops was released, classifying the story as a coordinated and slanderous attack against the Catholic Church, promising all appropriate legal measures and asking the faithful not to give credit to unfounded accusations moved by obscure interests. Bishop Augustus Bennett, the man at the center of the accusations, released a statement through his press officer in Washington, D.C. The text was short, dignified, and absolutely convincing for those who didn't know the backstory. "I deeply regret that my name is being used in such serious and unfounded accusations. Throughout my priestly life, I have dedicated myself to the service of God and the care of souls entrusted to me. I trust in divine and human justice for truth to prevail over lies and slander." The statement was widely reproduced by Catholic media outlets and by conservative politicians who came out in defense of the bishop. An influential senator went so far as to suggest that the story was part of an organized campaign to destabilize the Catholic Church in the United States, implying involvement of foreign forces interested in weakening the Christian values of American society. Emily followed everything with a mixture of exaltation and terror. On one hand, finally her truth was being told. Finally, other women were finding the courage to speak. On the other, she felt exposed in a way she had never imagined possible. Although Richard had used initials to identify her in the story, it wouldn't be difficult for those who wanted to discover her real identity. And people wanted to discover. Journalists from various outlets called during the day, requesting exclusive interviews. Television program producers offered considerable sums for her to appear on the shows, telling her story in detail. Lawyers specialized in cases against the church contacted them, offering their services for free. "I can't believe this is happening," she said to Nathan at the end of the day, as they watched 60 Minutes, which dedicated a 15-minute report to the case. For so many years I believed that no one would ever listen to me, that no one would ever believe me. Nathan held her hand as they watched interviews with sexual abuse experts discussing the patterns of behavior described in the story, the manipulation, tactics used by predators in positions of authority, the difficulties faced by victims in reporting cases involving religious figures. "You were very brave," he said. "Not only to talk to me, but to authorize the publication of the story knowing the risks we would run. But the risks were greater than they imagined." Monday morning, when Nathan went out to buy bread at the nearest bakery to the house where they were staying, he found two men waiting for him on the sidewalk. They were well-dressed, polite, with the confident posture of those accustomed to solving complicated problems for important people. "Mr. Williams," said the taller of the two, a man of about 50 with grey hair and an impeccable suit. "My name? Fears Dr. Evangelist. I'm a lawyer. I would very much like to talk to you about a way to resolve this unpleasant situation in a manner that benefits all parties involved." "I have nothing to talk to you about," Nathan replied, trying to pass by them, but the second man took a lateral step, discreetly blocking his path. "I believe you do, Mr. Williams. We have here a very generous proposal from our clients. A substantial amount of money, enough for you and your wife to start life anew anywhere in the world, away from all this confusion. All we ask in return is a public statement acknowledging that the accusations were based on misunderstandings, that there was no intention to defame anyone, and that you regret any embarrassment caused. And if I refuse?" Dr. Evangelist's smile didn't change, but something icy passed behind his eyes. "It would be a pity, Mr. Williams, a terrible pity, because sometimes when people insist on paths that aren't healthy for them, they end up stumbling. Accidents happen, especially on mountain roads, isn't that right? As happened with your brother Jason." The mention of his brother was like a punch in Nathan's stomach. It was the definitive confirmation that Jason had not died in an accident, that he had been murdered for being too close to the truth, and it was also a crystal-clear warning: keep messing with this, and you'll meet the same fate. "I'll think about the proposal," Nathan said, forcing his voice to sound calm. "That's good. You have until Wednesday to decide." "Oh, and Mr. Williams?" The lawyer handed over a thick envelope. "These are some photographs our clients managed to obtain. Your wife is really a very beautiful woman. It would be a pity if something happened to her too." Nathan took the envelope with trembling hands and saw that it contained photos of Emily taken with a telephoto lens in recent days, leaving the hotel, entering Richard's house, walking down the street. Photos that proved they were being constantly watched, that their privacy had been completely violated. When he returned to the house, Emily immediately noticed that something had happened. Nathan was pale, tense, with an expression she hadn't seen since the first days after the revelation of the trauma. "They directly threatened us," he said, telling about the meeting with the lawyers, "and they confirmed that Jason was murdered." Emily felt the ground open beneath her feet. One thing was to suspect they were at risk, quite another to have confirmation they were dealing with people willing to kill to protect their secrets. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "I don't know. Honestly, I don't know." They spent the day in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, trying to process the magnitude of what they were facing. It wasn't just a fight for justice. It was literally a matter of life and death. At night, Richard's phone rang. It was an elderly woman with a trembling but determined voice who identified herself as Sister Margaret, the French nun who had raised Emily at the orphanage. "I read the story," she said. "I read it and cried, because finally I understood many things that happened at that time, and that I didn't know how to interpret at the time. I need to talk to Emily. I have important information about that terrible man." The meeting was scheduled for the next day at the parish house of St. Rosary Church in Old Mill, where Sister Margaret now lived after retiring from work at the orphanage. It was a public, safe place where they would hardly be disturbed. Emily hadn't seen the nun for almost 5 years, since her graduation from university. Sister Margaret was older, more fragile, but her blue eyes still maintained the same sharp intelligence and the same kindness that Emily remembered from childhood. "My dear child," said the nun, hugging Emily tightly, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for not realizing what was happening, for not protecting you when you needed it." "You didn't know," Emily replied. "No one knew. He was very careful. But I should have suspected. There were signs, strange things that happened." At that time, Sister Margaret looked at Nathan with gratitude. "Thank you for giving my girl the courage to finally tell the truth." She told them that after Father Augustus's departure, other strange changes had happened at the orphanage. 2 girls who were close to Emily were suddenly transferred to other institutions without clear explanations. Documents disappeared from the files, and a few months later, a very generous anonymous donation arrived that allowed the complete renovation of the orphanage. "At the time, I thought it was divine providence," said the nun. "But now I understand it was dirty money, payment for silence." But the most important information that Sister Margaret had to give was about a diary that Emily had written during adolescence. "You don't remember, my child, but after that man left, you began to write obsessively in a small notebook. I thought they were prayers, spiritual reflections. But one day, by chance, I read a few pages and saw that they were memories, detailed descriptions of what had happened." Emily was in shock. She didn't remember having written any diary at that time. Her memory of the months following Father Augustus's departure was hazy, fragmented, as if her mind had deliberately erased that traumatic period. "What happened to the diary?" Nathan asked. "I kept it," Sister Margaret replied. "I knew it was important, but I didn't understand exactly why. I kept it with Emily's other belongings, thinking that maybe one day she would want to recover them." The nun went to her room and returned with an old shoebox, tied with a faded string. Inside were photographs from Emily's childhood, some drawings she had made when she was little, and a blue-covered school notebook with pages yellowed by time. Emily took the notebook with trembling hands. It was her adolescent handwriting, but she didn't remember having written a single line of those pages. It was as if she were looking at the diary of a stranger, of a girl she had been, but could no longer access in her memory. The first pages were dated 3 months after Father Augustus's departure. The writing was childish, confused, but disturbingly detailed. "Today I understood that what Father Augustus did with me wasn't normal. Sister Claire was explaining about sins of the body, and I realized that what he called sacred revelations were actually terrible sins. But then why did God let it happen? Why didn't God protect me if I was so special as he said?" The following pages were even more disturbing. The adolescent Emily had recorded each meeting, each conversation, each touch, with a photographic precision that only a traumatized mind could maintain. There were dates, times, locations, even transcriptions of complete conversations. "This is evidence," Nathan said, leafing through the pages with reverent care. "It's a contemporaneous record, written at the time of the events. Legally, it's much stronger than testimonies given years later." But there was something else in the diary that none of them was prepared to find. In the last pages, apparently, written at the end of Emily's adolescence, there were notes about other girls from the orphanage. "Talking with Helen today, I discovered she also had special meetings with Father Augustus, and Carla too. We were 3. He told each one she was special, that she was the only chosen one. But we were 3. Maybe there were more." And then, on the last written page, an entry that made Emily's blood freeze in her veins. "Today, a letter arrived for me. It had no return address, but I know he sent it. It said he was watching me, that he knew I was asking questions, talking to the other girls. It said that girls who asked too many questions sometimes disappeared, that sometimes God called them to him earlier. I'm afraid. I'm going to hide this notebook and never talk about this with anyone again." The silence that followed the reading was heavy as lead. It was the definitive proof that Father Augustus not only abused orphaned girls, but also threatened them when they showed signs of resistance or that they might speak. "How many of these girls are still alive?" Nathan asked. Sister Margaret. Sighed deeply. Helen died in a car accident at 22. Carla committed suicide at 25. There were 3 other girls who also had special meetings with him but never talked about it. One became a nun and is in a cloistered convent in Kansas. Another married and moved to Canada. The third... She hesitated, as if the next words were particularly difficult to pronounce. The third was found dead on a rural road 2 years after Father Augustus's departure. Officially, it was classified as robbery, followed by rape and murder. She was only 19. Emily felt nausea rise in her throat. They weren't just victims of sexual abuse. They were potential witnesses who had been systematically silenced, some through intimidation, others through death. "We need to take this to the police," Nathan said. This diary, along with information about the suspicious deaths of the other girls, might be enough to open a formal criminal investigation. But Sister Margaret sadly shook her head. "My son, do you think in all these years no one ever tried to report this man? Do you believe the families of these girls never asked questions? They did, and all were directed to accept the official versions, not to mess with delicate matters, to trust in divine justice. And if they insisted," Emily asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Some had accidents, others received threats. One mother who wouldn't stop asking questions about her daughter's death was admitted to a psychiatric clinic, diagnosed with depression and suicidal ideation. When she came out 6 months later, she no longer talked about the subject. It was a terrifying pattern of systematic silencing that extended for decades. It wasn't just an abusive priest protected by the institution, it was a sophisticated cover-up operation that involved police authorities, doctors, lawyers, a network of accomplices and collaborators willing to do anything to keep the secrets buried. "So what do we do?" Emily asked. "Accept the lawyer's proposal, take the money and disappear? Let him be promoted to cardinal and continue doing this to other girls?" Nathan looked at her with an intensity that reminded her of the first day they met, in the farm chapel. "We do what Jason would do, we fight. Even knowing the risks, even knowing we might not survive, we fight." Sister Margaret observed them with the wisdom of someone who had spent her life caring for people in difficult situations. "If you decide to continue, you can't count only on American journalists and lawyers. You need international help, organizations that are outside the church's sphere of influence in the United States." She was right. Richard had mentioned contacts in international outlets, human rights organizations that specialized in cases of sexual abuse in religious institutions. They needed to make the case too big, too public, too international to be suppressed by local power structures. When they left the parish house, it was already night. The historic town of Old Mill was quiet, with its cobblestone streets illuminated by old lamps that created dancing shadows on the colonial facades. They walked in silence to the car, each lost in their own thoughts. Emily carried the diary against her chest as if it were a sacred relic, the High. Proof that her memory hadn't invented anything, that everything really happened as she remembered. "Nathan," she said when they reached the car, "if we decide to continue with this, there will be no turning back. They will try to destroy us in every possible way. Our life will never be normal again." He stopped in front of the passenger door, held her face between his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that mixed love, protection, and promise that, whatever happened, they would face it together. "Emily," he said when they separated, "I didn't marry you to have a normal life. I married you because I love you exactly as you are. Strong, brave, integral. If fighting for justice is part of who you are, then that's what we're going to do." That night, staying at a small hotel in the historic center of Old Mill, they made love with a desperate intensity, as if it were the last time, as if they wanted to engrave in memory each touch, each kiss, each moment of intimacy before the world around them definitively exploded. And the next morning, when they woke, up embraced between the white sheets with the mountain sun coming through the colonial windows, Emily said, "Let's continue. For Jason, for the other girls who died, and for all who can still be saved." Nathan smiled and kissed her forehead. "Then we'll need to be smarter than them, and much braver. But neither of them imagined that, while they were making this historic decision. 3 black cars were already parked on the streets around the hotel, and that armed men were waiting only for final instructions to act. The phone in the room rang at 5:30 in the morning, cutting through the dawn silence like a sharp blade. Nathan woke up instantly, with that visceral sense of danger that primitive instincts recognize even before the rational mind understands what's happening. Emily awakened beside him, her eyes still confused with sleep but already alert to the tension emanating from her husband's body. "Don't answer," whispered a male voice on the other end of the line when Nathan picked up the phone. It was Richard, but there was something strange in his tone, a controlled urgency that made Nathan's heart race. "Get out of there now. Through the back window, if possible. There are men at the reception, others on the street. You have 5 minutes at most." The line was cut before Nathan could ask any questions. He looked at Emily and saw in her green eyes the same fear he felt in his own chest, but also something more, an iron determination that he was learning to recognize and admire in the woman he loved. "They've come for us," he said, already jumping out of bed and beginning to put on the clothes scattered on the floor. Emily didn't waste time with questions or lamentations. She quickly stored the diary in a small bag, put on the most practical clothes she had, and in less than 3 minutes was ready to flee. Years of life in the orphanage had taught her to always be prepared for abrupt changes, to leave without warning, to carry only the essentials. The hotel where they were staying was an 18th century colonial mansion adapted for tourism. The rooms had high windows with wrought iron bars that gave onto an internal courtyard surrounded by a low wall. On the other side of the wall was a vacant lot that descended toward the historic center of town. Nathan carefully opened the window and looked outside. The courtyard was dark, silent, apparently empty, but there was something wrong in the excessive quietness of the morning. Not even the birds were singing, as if nature itself perceived that something dangerous was happening. "Can you climb down?" he asked Emily, assessing the distance between the window and the courtyard floor. "I can," she replied with a confidence that surprised him. In the orphanage, escaping through the rooms was almost a sport. Nathan went down first, hanging from the windowsill and dropping to the courtyard, with the least possible noise. Emily followed him with an agility that revealed prior practice in this type of maneuver. They crossed the courtyard in silence, climbed the low wall and found themselves in the vacant lot on the other side. That's when they heard the voices. "Empty room," someone said with a New York accent, "but the beds are warm. They left recently." "Check." "The back," replied another voice, this one with authority. "And tell the others they can't have gone far." Nathan and Emily crouched behind a stone wall covered with vegetation, trying to control their breathing, as they heard heavy footsteps circling the hotel. There were at least 4 men, maybe more, systematically searching for them. "We have to leave town," Nathan whispered. "They'll block the main roads, but I know mountain trails that give access to Highway 40. They began to descend the vacant lot, using the shadows of the colonial mansions as cover. Old Mill was slowly awakening. Some windows were beginning to light. Up, the first merchants were opening their shops. Early tourists were photographing the historic churches under the golden light of the rising sun. The normality of the town contrasted drastically with the terror that Emily and Nathan felt. It was surreal to walk on the cobblestone streets where they had romantically strolled the night before, now fleeing from men who probably had orders to kill them. When they reached the central square, they saw 2 black cars strategically parked at the main exits of the town. Men in dark suits were talking on cell phones, clearly coordinating the search. It was obvious they couldn't use the conventional roads. "This way," Nathan said, guiding Emily through a narrow alley that climbed toward the rural area. "There's an old trail that the gold traders used in the 18th century to transport gold. It gives access to the highway, but from the opposite side of town." The walk was exhausting. The trail was poorly maintained, covered with dense vegetation, with loose stones and holes that made each step a dangerous adventure. Emily, despite not being accustomed to this type of physical exercise, kept pace without complaining, driven by adrenaline and the certainty that their lives depended on this escape. After 2 hours of walking, When they were far enough from town to feel relatively safe, they stopped to rest in the shade of a centennial tree. That's when Nathan's cell phone rang. "Are you okay?" It was Richard, his voice loaded with concern. "So far, yes. How did you know they were coming?" "I have a contact in the Old Mill Sheriff's Department. He called me in the middle of the night, saying he had received a strange order not to respond to incidents in the historic center area between 5 and 7 in the morning. When he insisted on knowing why, he was told to not ask questions and not see anything that might happen during that period. It was confirmation that the operation against them had official support, that corruption extended even to the local police forces. There was no authority they could trust, no institution that could offer protection. "Where are you now?" Richard asked. Nathan described the approximate location. "But we can't stay here long. They'll extend the search to the rural areas." "Listen carefully," Richard said, his voice assuming a tone of controlled urgency. "I managed to contact a BBC journalist who's in the US, doing a series of stories on sexual abuse in religious institutions in North America. She wants to meet with you, but it has to be today while we still have time." "Where?" "In Charleston. There's a British Airways flight leaving at 11 at night for London. If we can get you on that plane with the journalist as a witness, it becomes much harder for them to do anything." It was a risky proposal, but perhaps the only chance they had. Staying in the United States meant living constantly on the run, waiting for someone to appear at any moment to silence them definitively. Going abroad, with the protection of the international press, could give them the security needed to continue fighting. "How do we get to Charleston without being detected?" Nathan asked. "I have a van. I'll pick you up at the entrance to Highway 40 at the gas station at mile marker 95. I'll be there at 2 in the afternoon." They resumed walking, now with a defined destination and renewed hope. The trail became less steep as they approached the highway, but the sun was getting stronger, and Emily was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. "Want to stop and rest?" Nathan asked, noticing she was breathing with difficulty. "No, we can't stop if they catch us now." She didn't finish the sentence, but both knew what was implied. There would be no second chance, no more opportunities to tell the truth. When they finally reached the highway, it was almost noon. The gas station was a few miles ahead, but they couldn't risk walking along the roadside, where they would be easily spotted by any passing car. They hid in a wood beside the highway and waited. Time dragged like molasses. Each minute seemed like an hour. Cars passed constantly, some of them black cars with dark windows that made both their hearts race, thinking they might be the men searching for them. At 2 o'clock sharp, they saw Richard's van approaching. It was a common commercial vehicle, with nothing that would draw attention, perfect for passing unnoticed. They ran from the woods to the road and quickly entered the vehicle. Richard wasn't alone. There was a blonde, middle-aged woman in the passenger seat, with an evident British accent and a digital recorder in hand. It was Sarah Thompson, BBC correspondent specialized in investigations of corruption and abuse of power in religious institutions. "I'm sorry for what you're going through," she said, as Richard drove toward Charleston, "but I want you to know that your story is already being told internationally. We have partners in several countries preparing coordinated stories for simultaneous publication." During the 2-hour journey to the state capital, Emily told her whole story again, this time being recorded for an international audience. It was emotionally devastating to relive each detail of the trauma, but it was also liberating to know that finally her voice would be heard beyond the borders of the United States, in places where the influence of the American Catholic Church couldn't reach. Sarah asked precise, professional questions, but also demonstrated a genuine empathy that helped Emily feel comfortable to speak about the most difficult aspects of her experience. The journalist had interviewed hundreds of abuse victims throughout her career, knew how to conduct the conversation in a way to obtain important information without re-traumatizing the person speaking. "The pattern is always the same," Sarah commented after hearing the complete story. "Predators in positions of religious authority use the victim's faith as a weapon against them, and religious institutions always react the same way. They protect the predator, silence the victims, transfer the problem instead of solving it. When they arrived in Charleston, the plan was simple. Check into a hotel near the airport, finish the interview and board the night flight to London. But when they were arriving at the hotel, Richard's cell phone rang again. It was the same. Contact from the Old Mill Sheriff's Department with alarming information. "They discovered about the flight," said the officer with a tense voice. "There have been men at the airport since 3 in the afternoon. And Richard, there's more. They just found a body on a rural road near Old Mill. An elderly woman identified as Sister Margaret." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Emily began to cry silently, not only for the death of the nun who had raised her, but for the understanding that her decision to tell the truth had cost an innocent life. "It was because of us," she whispered. "They killed her because she helped us." Nathan held her hand tightly, trying to offer comfort in a situation where there was no comfort possible. Sarah Thompson observed the scene with the somber expression of someone who recognizes the signs of a silencing operation that had gone completely out of control. "Change of plans," she said. "We can't use the airport, but I have contacts at the British Embassy. If we can get there, you'll be under diplomatic protection until we resolve a safe way to get you out of the country." They changed direction, now heading to the neighborhood, where the embassy was located. It was a race against time. The longer they took, the greater the chance of being discovered and intercepted. That's when they saw the black cars on the street that gave access to the embassy. At least 6 vehicles strategically parked, with men in dark suits who clearly weren't there by coincidence. "They're everywhere," Richard said, making a quick turn to avoid being seen. "Airport, embassy, probably the bus station and terminal, too." It seemed all exits had been blocked, that there was nowhere to flee. That's when Sarah's cell phone rang. She answered, spoke quickly in English, and then hung up with an expression of relief on her face. "I have an idea," she said. "There's an event at the University of Virginia tonight, an international symposium on human rights with participation of journalists and academics from several countries. If we can get in there, you'll be under the protection of the international academic community." It was a possibility, but also a huge risk. The event would be public, with many people, but it would also be a place where they could easily be identified and intercepted. "It's our best chance," Nathan said, "and maybe our only chance." When they arrived at the UVA campus, the event had already started. The auditorium was packed with professors, students, journalists, representatives of human rights NGOs. It was exactly the kind of environment where it would be difficult for the men pursuing them to act without drawing attention. Sarah knew several of the event participants. She discreetly approached some journalist colleagues, explained the situation, and in a few minutes there was an improvised protection plan for Emily and Nathan. That's when something happened that no one expected. During a break in the event, a man in a cassock approached Emily. He was a young priest with a friendly appearance and a genuine smile that made her instinctively step back. "Emily," he said, "my name is Father John. I read the story about you in the newspaper, and I wanted you to know that not all of us are like that monster who hurt you." She looked at him with distrust. After all she had been through, it was difficult to trust any religious figure. "I know it's hard to believe," Father John continued, "but there are many of us in the church fighting against these abuses, trying to change things from the inside out, and I have information that can help you." He explained that he was part of a group of progressive priests who had been documenting cases of sexual abuse and institutional cover-up for several years. They had evidence that Bishop Augustus was not an isolated case, but part of an organized network of predators protected by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. "We have documents, audio from meetings where decisions were made to silence victims, records of transfers of abusive priests," he said, "but we needed someone with enough courage to make all this public, someone like you." It was an unexpected turn. They weren't alone. There were allies within the church itself, people willing to risk their careers and even their lives to expose the truth. Father John discreetly introduced them to other members of the group. There were 5 priests and 2 nuns, all young, all determined to reform the church from the inside out. They had organized a complete archive of abuse cases, an investigation that had lasted years. "Why did you never make this public before?" Nathan asked. "Because alone we would easily be silenced," replied one of the nuns, Sister Christina. "But now, with the international repercussion of your case, we have a window of opportunity. The world is paying attention." They spent the next 2 hours on the university campus, protected by the crowd of academics and journalists, organizing a coordinated strategy. The documents that the Progressive Priests group had collected would be combined with the evidence obtained by Jason and with Emily's testimony to form a complete dossier that would be delivered simultaneously to the international press, to the Vatican, and to American federal authorities. That's when Richard's cell phone rang once more. It was his contact in the police with even more alarming information. "Richard, they just arrested Sarah Thompson at the hotel where you were staying. The official charge is drug possession, but it's obviously a setup. And there's more. There's an arrest warrant against Nathan and Emily for defamation and false statements." The situation had completely deteriorated. Not only were they being pursued by killers, but now they were also wanted criminals. It was confirmation that corruption extended to the highest levels of the justice system. "We have to leave the country today," Father John said. "I have contacts in Canada, people who can help you cross the border without official documentation." It was a desperate proposal, but perhaps the only alternative left. Staying in the United States meant certain arrest, and in prison they would be easy targets to be definitively silenced. "And you?" Emily asked. "If you help us escape, you'll be persecuted too." Father John smiled with a serenity that reminded her of the saints painted in the frescoes she restored. "Sister, some fights are worth any sacrifice, and this is one of them." That night, as they prepared for an escape that might be the last chance they would have to survive, Emily and Nathan embraced in a silent corner of the university campus. The city of Charleston extended around them, with its lights flashing like earthly stars, indifferent to the drama unfolding in its streets. "When all this began," Emily said, her voice low so as not to be heard by the others, "I just wanted justice for myself. Now I realize it's much bigger than that. It's a fight that will continue even after we leave here," Nathan replied. "Other people will have to take up the battle, but at least we managed to take the first step." They made love that night in an empty room at the university, while allies kept watch outside. It was a moment of intimacy stolen in the midst of chaos, a reminder that no matter how much the world around them was falling apart, the love they felt for each other remained intact, unbreakable. When dawn broke, it was time to leave. A car with Canadian plates was waiting for them in the parking lot, driven by a man who introduced himself only as Michael, and promised to take them to the border by paths that didn't appear on any map. Before getting in the car, Emily said goodbye to the priests and nuns who had risked everything to help them. It was a farewell loaded with emotion and gratitude, but also with fear for what might happen to those brave people after they left. "Take care," she said to Father John, "and keep fighting." "Always," he replied. "And you, when you're safe. Don't stop telling the truth. The world needs to hear." The car departed early in the morning, taking Emily and Nathan away from everything they knew, toward an uncertain future in a foreign country. But for the first time in weeks they felt hopeful. The truth had been told, the silence had been broken, and although they might be fleeing like criminals, they knew they were, in fact, heroes of a fight that was just beginning. As Charleston disappeared in the rear-view mirror, Emily held Nathan's hand and thought of the 15-year-old girl who had been abused in a distant orphanage. That girl had grown up, found love, found courage, and finally found her voice. And now that voice would echo throughout the entire world, carrying with it the promise that other girls would not endure the same silence she had borne for so many years. The sun was rising behind the mountains of Virginia, painting the sky in golden tones that seemed like a divine blessing over their escape. It was the beginning of a new day, of a new life, of a new hope. But it was also just the beginning of a journey that would test all the limits of the love they had for each other. The border between the United States and Canada had never seemed so distant as during those 8 hours of travel on rural roads that didn't appear on any map. Michael, the smuggler taking them, knew every trail, every checkpoint, every guard who could be bribed or avoided. He was a man of few words, who smoked constantly and drove with the absolute concentration of someone who knew that a single wrong decision could cost the lives of everyone in the car. Emily and Nathan traveled most of the time in silence, embraced, in the back seat, each lost in their own thoughts about everything they had left behind. Their families, their friends, their careers, their entire lives had been abandoned in a matter of days. It was as if they had died to the world they knew and were being reborn in some undefined place on the other side of the border. When they finally crossed into Canadian territory, through an improvised bridge over a creek that didn't even have a name on official maps, Emily began to cry. Not from sadness, but from a relief so intense that it manifested physically, as if all the muscles in her body could finally relax after weeks of constant tension. "We made it," she murmured in Nathan's ear. "We're alive, we made it." He kissed her with a desperate tenderness, as if he wanted to engrave in his memory the taste of her lips, the scent of her hair, the feeling of having her safe in his arms. "We made it, my love, but it's not over yet." Michael took them to a small town called Pine Grove, where they had contacts who could help them regularize their situation as political refugees. It was a typical border town, with dirt roads, simple houses, a slower pace of life that contrasted dramatically with the urban life they were accustomed to in Virginia. The house where they were sheltered belonged to a family of Lebanese immigrants who had arrived in Canada decades earlier, fleeing religious persecution in the Middle East. Mrs. Faith and her husband Abraham welcomed Emily and Nathan with the natural hospitality of those who knew the meaning of seeking refuge far from the homeland. "Stay as long as you need," said Mrs. Faith, preparing a simple but clean room in the back of the house. "We know what it's like to flee from people who use faith to do evil." It was there, in that humble house in a town they had never heard of, that Emily and Nathan watched the unfolding of the story they had helped trigger. Father John had managed to maintain contact through an encrypted phone, informing them about developments in the United States. The arrest of BBC journalist Sarah Thompson had been a strategic mistake by the adversaries. The detention of a British journalist in clearly fabricated circumstances drew the attention of the international press, which began to investigate more deeply the case. Within 48 hours, reporters from several countries were in Charleston, asking uncomfortable questions about police corruption and crime cover-up. The Vatican, pressured by the international repercussion, announced it would send a special investigator to evaluate the serious accusations made against a member of the American ecclesiastical hierarchy. It was a diplomatically elegant way to abandon Bishop Augustus to his own fate. But the decisive blow came from where least expected. One of the women whom Emily and Nathan had interviewed, Mary Hope, the alcoholic who lived alone in Riverside, decided to break decades of silence and spontaneously sought the Federal Bureau of Investigation to tell her story. Her testimony was devastating. Unlike the other cases, which depended mainly on the traumatic memories of the victims, Mary Hope had kept physical evidence of the abuse. Letters that Father Augustus wrote to her in the following years, trying to keep her silenced through veiled threats disguised as spiritual guidance. Photographs that he himself had taken during the abuses as a form of emotional blackmail. "I kept everything for 40 years, she said in a press conference that was broadcast live on the internet, because I knew that one day the truth would appear. And when I read about the courage of that girl Emily, I knew it was my time to speak too." From Mary Hope's testimony, the FBI investigation rapidly expanded. Dozens of other cases were revealed, a cover-up network that extended across several dioceses was exposed, and federal prosecutors began to prepare criminal charges against multiple members of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Bishop Augustus tried to resist initially. He released a statement claiming he was the victim of an orchestrated defamation campaign and that he trusted justice to clarify the truth of the facts. But when the FBI presented the physical evidence obtained through Mary Hope, his version began to crumble. That's when something happened that surprised even the most experienced investigators. Confronted with irrefutable evidence, Bishop Augustus not only confessed his crimes, but offered to collaborate with the authorities to expose the entire cover-up network in exchange for a reduced sentence. The confession was filmed and fully released on the internet. It was a 72-year-old man, visibly dejected, admitting decades of sexual abuse against minors and vulnerable women. But more important than the individual confession were the names he revealed. Hierarchical superiors who knew of the cases, lawyers who helped silence victims, politicians who received favors in exchange for protection. For 40 years, he said in the recording, I used my position to satisfy sick impulses. And for 40 years, the institution that should have punished me protected me, promoted me, rewarded me, because it was more convenient to hide the truth than to face it. The repercussion of the confession was devastating for the Catholic Church in the United States. Faithful abandoned masses in protest, donations plummeted, religious vocations reached the lowest level in history. But paradoxically, it was also liberating for many victims who finally felt validated and heard. In the months that followed, more than 200 people sought the authorities to report cases of sexual abuse committed by members of the American clergy. It was as if the courage of Emily and the other women who spoke first had created a wave of collective liberation. The international impact was also significant. Pope Francis issued a public statement apologizing to the victims and promising structural reforms to prevent new cases. International human rights organizations began to monitor more closely the actions of the Catholic Church in the United States. But for Emily and Nathan, following all this from afar in voluntary exile in Canada, what mattered most was knowing that their voices had been heard, that their sacrifice had served something greater than themselves. They spent 6 months in the house of Mrs. Faith and Abraham, time enough for the political situation in the United States to stabilize and for them to obtain political refugee documents that would guarantee them international protection. During this period, their relationship deepened in ways they hadn't experienced before. Away from the pressures, the threats, the social obligations, they were able to rediscover themselves as people and as a couple. Emily began to paint again, not religious frescoes, but landscapes, portraits, abstractions that expressed feelings she had never been able to verbalize. Nathan, in turn, began to write. First just personal notes about everything they had lived through, then a complete book telling their story, and that of all the women who had the courage to speak. The book would be published simultaneously in English, French, and Spanish, with all proceeds going to organizations supporting victims of sexual abuse. It was during this period of reconstruction that Emily realized her relationship with faith had completely changed. She hadn't lost spirituality, but had freed herself from the institutional structures that imprisoned her. She began to see God not in ecclesiastical hierarchies, but in the goodness of people like Mrs. Faith, in the courage of Father John, in her own strength to survive and fight. I think I finally understood what true faith is, she said to Nathan one night, as they walked through the central square of Pine Grove, watching local families talking and playing under the centennial trees. What do you mean? True faith isn't blind obedience to human institutions. It's the courage to do what's right even when it costs everything you have. It's trusting that there's something greater that unites us all, something that transcends the evils that men do in the name of God. Nathan smiled and kissed her under the yellowish light of the old square lampposts. You're the wisest person I know. I'm not wise. I just learned in pain to distinguish between truth and lies. In the 8th month of exile, they received a call that would once again change the course of their lives. It was an American lawyer specialized in human rights, informing that the political situation had changed sufficiently for them to return to the United States without risk of persecution. The people who threatened you are in prison, or under investigation, the lawyer explained, and you are considered national heroes by a good part of civil society. There are universities offering positions, publishers interested in publishing your story, NGOs wanting to hire you as consultants. It was tempting, but after months of peace and simplicity in Canada, The idea of returning to public exposure didn't seem attractive. They had found something precious in that exile, a life that was really theirs, away from the spotlights, the pressures, the expectations. What if we stayed here? We stayed. Emily suggested one night when they were discussing the possibility of return. What if we built a new life away from all that? Nathan considered the proposal. There was beauty in the idea of completely starting over, of becoming different people than they were before. But there was also a responsibility that weighed on them. We still have work to do, he finally said. Our fight served to expose the truth, but real change will take generations. If we return, we can help ensure that other children don't go through what you went through. It was a difficult decision, but in the end, they opted to return to the United States but not to Virginia. They chose Wilmington, a city where they could start over without the weight of memories, where Emily could open a restoration studio and Nathan could work with sustainable architecture. The return was more emotional than they expected. At the Wilmington airport, they were received by dozens of people. Abuse victims who had found courage to speak after their story, family members of people who had been silenced, human rights activists, journalists who wanted to continue covering the cases unfolding. Among the people waiting for them was Father John, who had been transferred to a parish in North Carolina after his participation in exposing the cover-up network became public. "Welcome back," he said, embracing them both with emotion. "Do you have any idea of the impact you've had? Hundreds of cases were exposed, dozens of criminals were arrested, an entire corruption structure was dismantled." "And the victims?" Emily asked. "How are they?" "Many still struggling, still healing, but all knowing they're not alone, that their voices matter, that truth can overcome lies." In the months that followed, Emily and Nathan established themselves in their new life in Wilmington. They bought a small house in the historic center, near the sea, where they could wake up every day hearing the sound of waves. Emily opened her studio on one of the city's most charming streets, specializing in the restoration of historical art, but also offering classes for young people interested in cultural preservation. Nathan began to work with sustainable architecture, projects for underprivileged communities, applying his technical knowledge to social causes. It was a way to use his class privileges to help people who never had the opportunities he had. But most importantly, they could finally live their love story without the pressures and traumas that had haunted them from the beginning. For the first time, they made plans for the future, trips they wanted to take, books they wanted to write, perhaps even children they wanted to have. A year after the return, on a summer afternoon when they were walking by Crystal Lake, Nathan suddenly stopped and knelt in the sand of the beach. "Emily," he said, taking from his pocket a simple gold ring that had belonged to his grandmother, "I know we're already married, but I want to marry you again. Not running from anything, not hiding from anyone, but celebrating everything we've been through together and everything we're still going to live." She began to cry, with joy, with emotion, with gratitude for having found a man who loved her, not despite her traumas, but including them as part of the story that had made them who they were. "Yes," she said, letting him place the ring on her finger. "Yes, I want to marry you every day for the rest of my life." The second wedding took place on North Beach, with only a few close friends present. Father John officiated the ceremony, which was simple, moving, full of meaning. There were no photographers, no press, no drama, just two people who loved each other, promising to build together a future based on truth, courage, and love. When they exchanged rings, Emily looked into Nathan's eyes and saw there everything she had dreamed of when she was an orphaned girl. Protection, respect, complicity, passion. He looked at her and saw the bravest woman he knew, someone who had transformed her pain into strength, her trauma into a fight for justice. "I love you," he said, "for who you are, for who you were, and for who you're still going to become." "And I love you," she replied, "for having taught me that true love doesn't save anyone. It strengthens people so they can save themselves." The celebration was small but joyful, with live music, dancing on the sand, and stories being told about how they had met, how they had fallen in love, how they had fought together against forces that seemed insurmountable. When the sun set over the North Carolina Sea, painting the sky in golden and rosy tones, Emily and Nathan walked hand in hand along the shore, planning the honeymoon they could finally have in peace. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. "It doesn't matter," she replied, smiling, "as long as it's with you." And there on that American beach, under the stars that were beginning to appear in the night sky, they understood that they had won, not just against the external enemies who tried to silence them, but against the internal demons that threatened to destroy their capacity to love and trust. True love, they discovered, wasn't what had saved them. It was what had remained, firm, constant, unbreakable, even when everything around them was bleeding. 5 years later, Emily gave birth to a girl they named Hope, in honor of Mary Hope, the brave woman who had given the final blow to the cover-up network with her testimony. The child grew up hearing stories about courage, justice, and the importance of always telling the truth, even when it costs dearly. Nathan wrote 3 books about their experience, all bestsellers that were translated into several languages. The income from the books financed the creation of a foundation that offers free legal and psychological support for victims of sexual abuse in religious institutions. Emily became one of the most respected restorers in the American South, but also a sought-after speaker to talk about trauma, recovery, and female empowerment. Her story inspired documentaries, plays, even a television series that aired in prime time. But most importantly, they had built a happy life based on genuine love and shared truth. Not a perfect life. There were still difficult days, occasional nightmares, moments when the past returned like an unexpected wave, but it was a real life, honest, full of meaning. In their intimate conversations, when their daughter had already gone to sleep and they remained embraced on the house porch watching the sea, they sometimes talked about how everything had begun in that old chapel of the farm in Virginia. "Do you regret anything?" Nathan asked on one of those nights. "Nothing," Emily replied without hesitation, "not even the pain, because it was what taught me to value the happiness we have now." "And I regret only one thing," he said, kissing the top of her head. "What?" "Not having met you before, not having been there to protect you when you needed it." Emily turned in his arms and looked at him with that smile he had fallen in love with since the first day. "But you were there. Maybe not physically, but you were. Every time I dreamed of a true love, every time I imagined what it would be like to be truly loved, I was dreaming of you." And there, on that porch of a simple house, in a city that had welcomed them with open arms, surrounded by the soft sound of waves and the scent of jasmine that Emily cultivated in the garden, they understood the most important truth of all. True love wasn't what had saved them from the terrible circumstances they faced. True love was what had remained, constant, growing, transforming through all these circumstances. It was what had begun in a silent chapel among ancient frescoes, had withstood the worst traumas 2 people can face, had survived persecution, exile, fear. And it was what would continue day after day, year after year, a love story that no longer needed dramatic endings because it had found something much more precious, a daily fresh start, a choice renewed each morning to continue loving and building together a life worth living. When the stars fully appeared, in the Wilmington sky that night, Emily and Nathan went inside hand in hand as they did every night for years, as they would do for all the nights they still had ahead. Love had won. Not in an epic or cinematic way, but in the only way that really matters. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of happiness conquered over each moment of pain they had faced together. And so, in the quietness of a house where a family slept safe and happy, ended a love story that had begun in shadow and ended in light, that had been born in silence and flourished in truth, that had withstood everything and remained intact, not because it was perfect, but because it was true.